Rome obsessed over written law. Laws had to be public, carved, official. And yet the real power in the Roman legal system belonged to jurists whose opinions were never law at all, just respected guesses that judges followed anyway. Modern AI has the same contradiction. Companies publish official rulebooks and constitutions for their models, but the model's actual behavior comes from something else entirely, learned patterns no one fully wrote down. Same contradiction, two different centuries. Let's find out why it keeps happening. Imagine you could only give a dog 3 commands. Sit, stay, come. Simple enough, until the dog faces a situation none of those 3 words quite covers. A stranger approaches. A car door opens. Another dog charges over. The dog doesn't have a 4th command to fall back on. It has to guess, based on the training it's already had, what the right response probably is. Now stretch that same problem across an entire civilization. Around 450 BC, Rome carved its first legal code onto 12 bronze tablets. The 12 tables covered the basics of a small farming society: property lines, debts, personal injury, family disputes. For the Rome of that era, it was enough. But Rome didn't stay small. Within a few generations, it was ruling over trade networks, foreign citizens, and disputes its original lawmakers never imagined. The tablets stayed the same size. The world governed by them did not. This is the core problem every growing system eventually runs into. Written rules are finite. The situations they need to cover are not. You can't predict every case in advance, and you can't rewrite the rulebook every time reality throws something new at it. So the real question was never just, what should the rules say? It was, what happens when the rules run out? Rome's answer wasn't to keep adding more laws. It was to build something almost nobody outside of legal history talks about today: a professional class of legal experts called jurists, or jurisprudence. Literally, those skilled in the law. These jurists weren't judges, and they weren't lawmakers. They had no official power to create new legislation. What they had was expertise and reputation. When a real dispute came up that the 12 tables didn't clearly answer, magistrates and judges would turn to these jurists for an opinion, known as a responsum. Over time, these opinions built up into something that functioned like law, even though technically it wasn't. Here's the mechanism that made this work. Jurists weren't inventing rules from nothing. They were reasoning from the existing principles in the 12 tables and from each other's prior opinions, extending them to new situations through consistent logic. A jurist's opinion only carried weight if it lined up with how similar cases had been reasoned about before. Wildly inconsistent opinions damaged a jurist's reputation, and reputation was the only currency they had. So the system policed itself, not through central enforcement, but through professional accountability. Rome added another layer to this on top. Each year, an incoming magistrate called a praetor would issue an edict, laying out how he intended to handle certain types of legal cases during his term. Many praetors reused and refined the edicts of their predecessors, so over time, this became a rolling, updated body of practical legal guidance sitting alongside the original written law. By the time Emperor Justinian ordered a massive legal compilation project in the 6th century AD, his team had to work through well over 1,000 legal texts, opinions, and imperial rulings just to organize centuries of accumulated interpretation into something usable. That compilation became known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, and it's still studied today as one of the foundations of legal systems across the world. What this reveals is something easy to miss. The 12 tables were never really Rome's legal system. They were the starting point. The actual system Romans lived under was the tablets, filtered through generations of expert interpretation, case by case, dispute by dispute. Rome didn't solve the problem of incomplete rules by writing more rules. It solved it by building a trusted, ongoing process for applying judgment to the gaps. That process took centuries to mature, which raises an obvious question. What do you do when you're trying to build the same kind of trustworthy judgment, but you don't have centuries to spare? That's the exact problem facing anyone building a modern AI system. An AI language model is typically given a written set of guidelines, sometimes even called a constitution, laying out the principles it should follow. Be helpful. Avoid harm. Stay honest. On paper, this looks a lot like the 12 tables, a compact, foundational set of rules. And just like the 12 tables, it's nowhere near enough on its own. A written guideline can say, avoid harmful content, but it can't spell out every single prompt, phrasing, or situation a user might bring to the system. There will always be cases the rule writers never thought of. So how does a model learn to handle those gaps? Not through jurists. Through training. During training, a model is exposed to enormous numbers of examples, human feedback, and correction signals. When it produces a response that aligns with the intended principles, that behavior gets reinforced. When it produces a response that violates them, that gets adjusted. Repeated over billions of examples, this process shapes the model's behavior so that it can generalize the underlying principles to brand new situations it has never explicitly seen before. This is the structural stand-in for Rome's jurist class. The written guidelines are the fixed core, just like the 12 tables. The training process is the interpretive mechanism, translating those fixed principles into flexible, situation-specific behavior, the same functional role Roman jurists played when they extended the 12 tables case by case. But there's an obvious difference already emerging, and it's worth sitting with. Rome's interpretive layer was built by thousands of individual humans, reasoning in public, over hundreds of years, with their names and reputations attached to every opinion. An AI model's interpretive layer is compressed into a training process that runs over months, built from data rather than lived legal reasoning, and shaped by engineers and researchers whose individual judgments are folded anonymously into the system's final behavior. So what's actually happening here isn't a technical novelty unique to artificial intelligence. It's the same institutional problem Rome faced 25 centuries ago, a fixed set of written rules that cannot possibly cover every case, paired with a separate mechanism built specifically to generalize those rules to situations nobody originally planned for. Rome had 500 years to refine its version. Modern AI systems are trying to solve a structurally similar problem in a fraction of that time. Which raises the real question. If you strip away the togas and the training data, and just look at what these two systems are actually doing, mechanism for mechanism, how much do they actually have in common? And where does the comparison genuinely fall apart? Strip away the historical costume, and both systems break down into the same three working parts. First, a fixed core. For Rome, that's the 12 tables and the foundational legal principles built on top of them. For AI, that's the written guidelines or constitution given to the model before training even begins. Second, an interpretive mechanism. For Rome, that's the reasoning of jurists and the accumulated body of their opinions. For AI, that's the training process itself, shaped by feedback and repeated exposure to examples. Third, applied judgment. For Rome, that's a magistrate's actual ruling in a specific case. For AI, that's the model's actual output in response to a specific prompt. Here's the important part. In both systems, what the end user actually experiences was never the fixed core by itself. A Roman citizen didn't experience the 12 tables directly. They experienced a magistrate's ruling, shaped by generations of jurist interpretation. A person using an AI model doesn't experience the written guidelines directly either. They experience an output shaped by everything the training process reinforced. The written rule, in both cases, is a floor. It's the minimum starting point, not the full story. That framework makes the similarities easier to see clearly, without stretching for them. Both systems treat their founding rules as incomplete by design, not as a flaw to be fixed, but as an expected starting condition. Both rely on refinement through repeated exposure to real cases, whether that's centuries of legal disputes or millions of training examples. Both depend on consistency for legitimacy. A Roman jurist's opinion only mattered if it lined up with how similar cases had been handled before. An AI model's output is only trusted if it behaves consistently across similar situations. And both create a kind of memory that outlasts any single contributor. Roman jurisprudence outlived every individual jurist who shaped it. A trained model's behavior outlives any single training example that helped shape it. But if the parallel were perfect here, it wouldn't be a very interesting comparison. It would just be the same idea wearing a different costume. The differences matter just as much, maybe more. Start with timescale. Rome's interpretive layer developed over roughly 1,000 years, from the 12 tables in 450 BC through Justinian's compilation in the 6th century AD. An AI model's interpretive layer is built in a matter of months. Centuries of accumulated human deliberation is being replaced by a comparatively short, intensive training process. Then there's accountability. Roman jurists were named individuals with public reputations on the line. If a jurist's reasoning was inconsistent or clearly self-serving, that damaged their standing, and their opinions lost influence. There's no equivalent for an AI model. If the system produces an inconsistent or flawed output, there's no single identifiable party whose reputation absorbs that failure the way a jurist would have. The responsibility is distributed across an entire training pipeline, not attached to one accountable person. There's also a difference in transparency. Roman jurists wrote down their reasoning. A responsum wasn't just a conclusion. It was an explanation, something later jurists could read, study, and challenge. The reasoning inside a trained AI model isn't like that. Its behavior comes from adjusted values across billions of internal parameters, a process that even the researchers who built it can't fully read back in plain language. It's a fundamentally more opaque kind of judgment than anything Roman law produced. And correction works differently too. Roman law evolved through visible, debated opinion, argued out over time in a way later generations could trace. An AI model gets corrected through retraining or fine-tuning, an adjustment process that isn't publicly argued out case by case the way jurist opinions were. Underneath both the similarities and the differences sits one pattern, and it isn't really about Rome, and it isn't really about AI. Any system that has to govern more situations than its original rule writers could foresee will eventually build some kind of judgment layer between the written rule and its real-world application. This isn't unique to ancient law or modern computing. It shows up in common law systems that rely on judicial precedent. It shows up in medicine, where clinical guidelines exist alongside a doctor's case-by-case judgment. It's a recurring feature of any system that scales past what its founding rules can fully specify, which points to the real lesson underneath all of it. The question was never whether a judgment layer would exist. In any system big enough, it always does. The real question is how well constrained that judgment layer is. Rome constrained its jurists through public reasoning, reputation, and consistency with precedent. Modern AI systems are still working out their own version of that same constraint, built for a judgment layer that isn't human at all. The danger was never that an interpretive layer exists on top of the written rule. It's what happens when that layer exists with nothing holding it accountable. So the next time you see a system fail, a law that didn't anticipate a case, an AI that got something wrong, even a company policy that broke down in a weird edge case, the real question isn't, why didn't they write a better rule? It's who or what was doing the judging, and what was keeping that in check. So here's what I want to know. Where else do you see this same pattern playing out? Rules that look fixed on paper, but are actually being quietly reinterpreted by something else underneath. Drop your example in the comments. I'll read through them and might feature the best ones in a follow-up.